Our next speaker is an Alice Springs Town Councillor. She's also the Director of Indigenous Research at the Centre of Independent Studies, that great Sydney think tank. Ladies and gentlemen, please make welcome Jacinta Price.
Thank you very much. It's really lovely to be here in a room full of wonderful allies. I almost kind of feel like maybe you should boo and cajole it to some point, just to even things out a bit or something. I don't know. And it kind of felt like I was in a mosh pit, like I was in my music days again, coming through the door. But no, thank you all for being here. And others have probably gone before me, and thank Christina Keneally, but I just want to give her a shout out again. Yeah, it was wonderful of her. Thanks, Christina. Anyway, I'll now begin. So I know that many of you already know a bit about my story, but for those of you in the room today who don't necessarily know so much, I'm going to start with the details of my beginning. So growing up in the desert town of Alice Springs meant growing up in a town where I could be free to be myself, and opportunity was always available to me if I recognised it and chose to take advantage of it. My mother was a very competitive sportswoman, and when I mean very competitive, she was very competitive. I think she played just about every sport that involved a ball, and I don't know how she did it, every day of the week, but she did. So I did, however, take after her in that regard, and I followed in her footsteps. And if I was going to participate in something, I would give my all. And if I was good at it, well, I would simply keep at it. I learned and played violin for a number of years, from the age of 10. It gave me and my string group the opportunity to perform with the Darwin Symphony Orchestra at the age of 11. A memorable performance situated in the dry riverbed at the base of the beautiful Simpsons Gap. I played Alice Springs and Northern Territory representative basketball, and I learned kickboxing and taekwondo. Don't ask me to show you the moves right now. I'd have to stretch a lot first. It's been a while. I performed as a hip-hop artist from the age of 15 up until about 7 years ago, and as a singer-songwriter on guitar from the age of 19 up until politics took over my life, basically. I was awarded a place on the honour roll of my primary school at graduation, and this had nothing to do with the fact that I am Indigenous. It was all due to my competitive nature and my thirst for opportunity, and my teachers recognised and encouraged this in me. To be honest, when I was shortlisted with a bunch of other very deserving students, I really didn't expect to be the recipient of the award. So when my name was called, I was surprised and humbled. In high school, despite becoming a teenage mother and carrying my firstborn throughout Year 12, I was given the Northern Territory's Indigenous Top Achiever Award. At that time in the Northern Territory, only 5% of students who graduated Year 12 were Indigenous, let alone pregnant as well. As a single mother with 3 young boys, I was co-producer, scriptwriter, songwriter and performer on Impaja TV's Indigenous-themed children's television show, Yamba's Playtime. Later, I would start my own small production company, which continued to produce the program, as well as tour musicals promoting education and health to children in regional and remote communities right across the country. And in fact, I think our program still airs throughout the United States on First Nations Experience television as well. Being Indigenous was never a hindrance to taking opportunities as they arose during my life in Alice Springs. In fact, at times, it was an advantage because being confident, educated, articulate and Indigenous opened many doors for me. Early in life, however, I was faced with many challenges from a young age. The most tragic example for me personally was witnessing my older brother grow increasingly ill from leukemia and saying goodbye to him for the last time when eventually the cancer took his life when he was just 10 years old. I was 3 at the time. It was only 2 years after losing my brother when my mother became critically ill with kidney failure. I watched her struggle, her forced move to Adelaide for treatment, the dialysis sessions, the unsuccessful attempt at home dialysis, which eventually led to the transplant that saved and extended her life. Losing my brother at 3 and almost losing my mother at the age of 6 made me acutely aware that life is very fragile. For years after my mother's kidney transplant, I would have nightmares about losing her and dreams that highlighted her fragility. Looking back, I understand just how strong my mother was to have braved the loss of her firstborn and then to have stood before death herself and said, "No, you will not take me also." At the time, I felt like I had to be the brave one, as I watched my father shift between moments of strength to moments of despair at the thought that he might lose the love of his life. I knew I had to be strong for my parents, and it was the love that I had been given by my parents, and by my family, and by our friends who had become family that ensured that I could be strong. My normal was having a black mum and a white dad. It was normal, in fact, for lots of others I grew up with in Alice Springs. During the hardest years of my childhood, the idea of race or skin colour played no part in the way that we dealt with life. Our closest family were those family friends who had become family. They were of mixed backgrounds, and we called ourselves the mix-up mob. But most importantly, they were human. They were aunts and uncles that were more like other sets of parents, and their children were my siblings. They loved us through our hardest times and to this day have played a significant role in shaping the woman I have become. My Warlpiri grandparents loved and supported my parents and were in fact incredibly proud of their union. My grandparents had first come into contact with white people in their late childhood. They quickly realised that they were simply other human beings and not pale ghosts of our ancestors. They could see their world was rapidly changing. They understood that adapting to change was inevitable in order to survive, and also to thrive. My mother was the 3rd youngest of my grandmother's 12 children. 6 of them had died in their first years of life, and one of those on the first day. My grandmother experienced the loss of 9 of her children before we lost her. Now only my mother and her younger brother are alive, and he donated one of his kidneys to my mother. This uncle too is now on dialysis and suffers from diabetes himself. To my grandparents, my father was a link between the new world and the old that was unravelling very quickly before their eyes. They saw that the marriage between my parents would bring opportunities for my mother that would benefit her and her children. They were confident that she would not turn their back on them and her culture while she took those opportunities. They taught her well and they trusted her. My father's family came from a working class Irish Catholic background. They too understood struggle. the need to work hard, to adapt and to take advantage of the opportunities that life presented. My grandfather built with his two hands the first real house that he and my grandmother would live in. Before this, they had lived in a dirt floor shack made of bush timber and hessian bags, and my grandmother washed their clothes in the creek nearby and gave birth to 2 children in that bush shack. My father was the second youngest of 9 children, and he and his family lost his sister to diphtheria when he was still a baby. Soon after this, my grandmother became a single mother when my grandfather's mental health began to deteriorate, leading to their separation. Growing up in a single-parent household, my father was the only child to finish school and take advantage of the access to the university education given to the working class by the Menzies government. On both sides of my family, we have experienced trauma. If we go back into my family history, on my father's paternal side, my great-great-great-grandmother came to Australia as a 17-year-old Irish potato famine orphan. She married my great-great-grandfather, who had been convicted of housebreaking at the age of 17 in Hampshire, England, and transported to Australia as a convict. See, we figured this out quite recently. In fact, we used to say, no, we've got Irish and Scots and Welsh, but we won't mention the English. And I've had to break it to my Scottish husband that actually we've got a fair bit of English in us as well. Both of them had been dispossessed of their own country in traumatic circumstances and had to adapt in order to survive. On my father's paternal side, there are also Irish convicts and poor lowland Scots Presbyterians. We truly are a mixture of many tribes on the white side of my ancestry. My Warlpiri grandparents were born into the middle of a stretch of country where, according to our most respected local historian, Dick Kimber, around 100 Aboriginal people were shot by white frontiersmen between 1911 and 1935. My grandfather was born in 1914 and my grandmother was born in 1929. When he was in his mid-teens, my Warlpiri grandfather had to flee to the west 100 kilometres to escape the murderous fury of a police punitive expedition during the Coniston Massacre of 1928. Between 70 and 100 Aboriginal men, women and children were killed then, according to the oral history of my mother's people. In 1942, my grandfather was arrested on his own land and marched behind a policeman on a camel with several other Warlpiri people in chains, 300 or so kilometres to a place called Aileron, and then trucked into Alice Springs, where he and the others were convinced to work as labourers for the army for 5 shillings a week, when a white worker could get 20 times that much. He did this work for the duration of the war. My grandfather was a very proud man. Despite the fact he fled the last officially sanctioned massacre with his family and survived and endured the indignity of being chained, marched and worked as a labourer on minimal pay, he never held resentments. In fact, he was proud of the work he had done for the war effort. In the army, the Aboriginal workers lived in clean, organised accommodation. They were well fed and given modern medical treatment for the first time. Their children went to school. Their children went to school for the first time also. Conditions were much better than they were on the stations where Aboriginal people were worked hard for minimal or no pay at all in often terrible circumstances. He never blamed a group of people based on the colour of their skin for the injustices he experienced. He always recognised the goodness and generosity of the good white bosses he worked for, and he was well prepared to denounce the bad, like the murderers of Coniston as well. He understood that in life you would experience injustice. You would fight where you could, win some battles and lose others. In the desert, Death could come at any time. Sorry, I've lost my mind. Could come at any time, well before the arrival of white man to this country. Tribal warfare was brutal and unforgiving. Men, women and children could be slaughtered during tribal conflict. He had to fight for his life against other Aboriginal men when he was a young man in the desert. He bore the scars to prove it. It was Aboriginal trackers who led the police party to the camps during the Coniston massacre. When he was arrested in 1942, it was an Aboriginal tracker who led the police to him and his relatives. Now, I don't tell these truths in order that one may discount one side or the other, and certainly not to belittle the savagery of frontier violence and make a comparison between Aboriginal on Aboriginal violence and the massive frontier violence carried out in some places by early settlers. I don't tell these truths to justify any of these kinds of acts in any way. I tell these truths so that we can all come to the understanding that we are all human beings. We are all capable of great good and of great evil. We humans are capable of anything and everything. If we look back into our family histories, we will find injustices, we will find trauma, and we will find love, strength, resilience, and the amazing human ability to overcome adversity. Now, I've given you just a couple of examples of the trauma I've experienced in my life. I could carry on for the rest of the day, giving you more. All of the terrible statistics we know about Aboriginal disadvantage in relation to all of these issues we care about: unemployment, disastrous health statistics, violence, abuse and neglect, are played out in real trauma and misery in the lives of real people living now. And many of these are my closest loved ones. In the year before the notorious intervention, my parents counted 30 funerals they should have gone to, then stopped counting. We don't count the deaths anymore, it's too painful. 3 of my own uncles were killed by alcohol. One of my cousins was only 21 when she drank herself to death. A young mother, a niece to me, was murdered by her estranged husband, also my relative. My mother's half-sister and her sister-in-law, my aunts, were murdered by other Aboriginal women. All were stabbed to death. The perpetrators were all Aboriginal. I helped to put the body of one of my favourite aunts in a body bag after she'd died of a massive heart attack following a week-long drinking binge. My mother had tried to get her to stop, but she didn't listen. I identified the body of my cousin in her late 20s after she'd been killed in a car crash caused by drunkenness and violence. The drunk ex-boyfriend of another cousin deliberately ran over her sleeping body on one of the greens on the Alice Springs golf course. She took a long time to die. And it doesn't stop. I have just been told just the other night that one of my aunts was hospitalised after a heart attack. Every one of my relatives in my mother's generation suffers from life-threatening chronic illness. Every one of them is threatened with violence at some stage, and usually on a regular basis. Few of those in my generation are in work or lead healthy lives. Many are in jail, many regularly hospitalised. In my children's generation, few attend school regularly or eat nutritious food. If intergenerational trauma is a reality, and my dispossessed, persecuted and poverty-stricken Irish, Scottish and English suffered such trauma, my near Indigenous ancestors suffered or witnessed massive trauma that is ongoing and directly affecting all of my Indigenous relatives right now, as I speak, how come I'm not curled up in the corner in a fetal position sobbing my heart out? Why haven't I drunk myself to death or suicided by now? After all, society tells me that I should be doing what I should be doing. I should be suffering from intergenerational trauma. Society tells me that the white man is to be blamed for my suffering. Society tells me that I am entitled to be compensated for my suffering. Society tells me that my culture will save me. But in order for this to happen, we must all be subject to welcome to country ceremonies at every event, in every institution, school, boardroom, community event, social event, and major TV event. We should change the date of Australia Day, and we have to change the Constitution. Society tells me not to speak out against family violence because this demonises the men responsible for the violence they perpetrate. Best to be politically correct and quiet and let victims suffer than to speak the truth. Did I mention I'm a conservative? But of course, I'm one of those rare conservatives who does not fit into a racial stereotype. By default, I should belong to the left. And in fact, the left think I do belong to them, literally, and are horrified, mortified that I dare to not follow the racial stereotype as they ordain. I remember when my mother first became a conservative politician. She would be the target of online criticism by mostly middle-aged white women of the left. I remember responding to a comment by one woman who said something like, "How can you, as an Aboriginal woman, be aligned with Liberals? Shame on you." And for the Americans in the room, not your kind of Liberals. Well, didn't that set me off? I responded forthwith, "How dare she think it her right to tell my mother how she should think and act as an Aboriginal woman and make the very ignorant and racist assumption that just because my mother is Aboriginal, her default political alignment would be with that of the left." You see, political correctness and racism are two sides of the same coin. They both work on stereotypes and deny truth. They need each other, feed off each other. Firstly, I'm human. Then I am Australian and one of Warlpiri and Celtic heritage. I am proud of my mix-up mob origins. My father tells the world that when we mix ourselves up, we improve the genetic makeup of our offspring. He tells anybody who'll listen that when we marry out of our genetic pool, we produce beautiful and intelligent children. Of course, he's told me this all my life, and there's probably moments where I should say, "No, Dad, look, you're overdoing it now." My husband brings me down a notch when that happens. So why does the left want to keep me in a box marked victim? Conservative governments passed, by far, most of the changes to legislation that have improved the lives of Indigenous people. They allowed people of mixed descent to exempt themselves from the laws that controlled their lives in 1954. They repealed that ordinance for everybody in 1964. Up until then, my mother and all of her family had been wards of the state. They extended the unrestricted right to vote in Commonwealth elections in 1962. That right had already been granted in every state except Queensland and Western Australia. In 1967, they put the most successful referendum in our history to the vote. In 1968, they made the paying of award wages to Aboriginal workers mandatory. In 1976, they passed the NT Land Rights Act. All of those were the achievements of conservative governments. The first Aboriginal parliamentarian in our history, Neville Bonner, sat with the Conservatives, as did the first Aboriginal member of the Northern Territory Parliament, Jacinta Nampijinpa. The first government in our history to be led by an Indigenous Australian, Adam Giles. the government my mother was a member of was a Conservative government. My mother became the only speaker of an Aboriginal language and the only woman in his cabinet. Of the 40 Aboriginal members of Parliament we have had so far voted into power, 22 of those were in the Northern Territory Parliament, and about half of those sat with the Conservatives. Our first Indigenous Minister for Indigenous Affairs is a Conservative. Sorry, Pat, we beat you to it. And still, the left act like they own us. Since then, it has been the left of politics who have tried to shut down our Aboriginal voices. In 2013, my mother, then an MLA in the Northern Territory Government, was banned from speaking to the students at the Indigenous Support Unit at Griffith University because some of the staff disagreed with her publicly expressed views. So much for respecting our elders, right? After supporting my mother and myself and speaking with me at the National Press Club, Professor Marcia Langdon wrote a piece for the Saturday paper titled "The Folly of Jacinta Price." In this dog whistle to left-wing extremists, she accused me of giving support and encouragement to the alt-right and white supremacists. Aboriginal people call activists like Marcia windscreen wipers. They're over here on your side 1 minute, and the next they are over there throwing stones at you. But the dog whistle worked. Left-wing extremists and white-hating Aboriginal activists have been vilifying me, threatening me with violence and even death ever since. She has had nothing to say about the racism and misogyny that has been thrown at an Aboriginal woman by left-wing white goons and radical activists. The hypocrisy of the left can be mind-boggling. In the Australian paper last Wednesday, Shadow Treasurer Chris Bowen spoke about the HTLV-1 retrovirus, which can cause leukemia and inflammatory diseases. It was first detected in 1988 in Central Australia, where up to 45% of the population of remote Aboriginal communities are infected, although few show symptoms. Like so many other dreadful diseases, like renal failure, rheumatic heart fever, diabetes, etc., that have killed or hurt so many of my loved ones, my people have the highest rates of this disease in the world. Mr. Bowen tells us that an Indigenous voice to Parliament is now needed to remind us more constantly of this health challenge for our First Peoples. Another Indigenous voice, ATSIC, was active from 1990, 2 years after the detection of the virus, until 2005. Right now, the Northern Territory has an Aboriginal Labor senator who is personally and directly acquainted with the dreadful health problems affecting our people. She knows all about it. Warren Snowden, who I opposed in the last federal election, is the longest-serving member of our federal parliament. In 2009, Snowden was promoted to Minister for Indigenous Health, Rural and Regional Health and Regional Service Delivery. He retained responsibility for Indigenous health until 2013. He still represents all of the Northern Territory outside of Darwin, where this virus is more prevalent than in the rest of the world. He is in Parliament because of the votes of the people of the remote communities. Why doesn't he represent them and tell the world of their problem? We have had an Aboriginal-controlled health services in Central Australia for 40 years. Why is yet another voice needed? Snowden's party, with the help of Get Up and the CFMEU, worked to make sure that his electorate was not represented by an Indigenous woman. They did the same to the previous member for Stewart in the Northern Territory Parliament, replacing my mother, Bess Price, a local Warlpiri woman, with a white man who has since resigned from the party and regularly attacks it in the media and on the floor of Parliament. Scott McConnell features prominently in Russell Skelton's 2010 book, King Brown Country, which focused on the behaviour of Jacinta Nampijinpa Anderson from Papunya, the King Brown of the title. Her close friend and collaborator was Scott McConnell, present member representing the seat of Stewart in Northern Territory Parliament. Skelton accuses both Anderson and McConnell of very questionable practices while responsible for the administration of Harts Bluff in McConnell's case and Papunya in the case of both McConnell and Anderson. None of his allegations have been convincingly addressed by either of them in the media, and neither have they had to face court. Skelton is hardly a raving alt-right-wing white supremacist. He has spent his life working for Fairfax Media and for the ABC. He is married to the ABC presenter Virginia Trioli. And yet, nothing came out of his 2010 book. He made the point that the two he focused on got away with what he was accusing them of because they had the full support of the Australian Labor Party and Warren Snowden. Labor depends on the lack of facility with English and education generally of the people of the bush for their methods to be effective. They also depend on the political correctness of the media not to question or even know what is going on in those communities. And it works. It really does. 30 years he's been in that seat. Labor depends, and of course, our taxpayer national broadcaster, the ABC, could be relied upon to do their bit for Labor. I was interviewed by Adam Steer with ABC Darwin. Out of the blue, he accused my mother of the misuse of government funds and government vehicles and being investigated by Four Corners as a result. I tell you, I was gobsmacked. This was an out-and-out lie. I challenged him right there on the spot, and he later apologised on air. But the dog whistle had been blown. Another ABC staffer, Oliver Gordon, based in Alice Springs, but originally from the leafy green suburbs of Melbourne, accused me of Islamophobia because in 2014, I'd posted on my personal Facebook page the testimony of an ex-Muslim woman concerning the misogyny of the religion she'd resigned from. I'm sure it would have been okay if she had been an ex-Catholic. These people will try anything. They don't want to hear from women or Indigenous people who disagree with them. They will do all they can to take our voices from us. They are liars and hypocrites. As in the last federal election, will the voters of this country see through all of this hypocrisy? The left has become hell-bent on stifling progress in this politically correct climate, and all in the name of tolerance and acceptance. We have too suddenly allowed the creation of more division among us. The left creates more and more categories for the pigeonholing of us all. On a daily basis, we bear witness to the victim status Olympics. It seems that everyone is competing for victim status, as if somehow being a victim provides fulfilment. Yet the social justice warriors of the left put all of their efforts into silencing the voices of the real victims, who cry out for justice. I'm a conservative because I am nobody's victim. I can live my own life, my own way, and I will spend my life fighting to give a voice to those who are denied one. Thank you.